as you can see on the screen, the theme for this year is called Design at / From the Seams. And that essentially communicates the idea of the fact that when different things, people, practices, thoughts, disciplines, ways of being come together, those seams that are formed, what happens from there and what happens when you design at those boundaries, through those intersections, through those interconnections and things like that. So across the 3 days, yesterday was the first day, today is the second day, and tomorrow is the third day, we are exploring different sub-thematics for each day. Today, day 2 is about speculative certainties, and this entire day's program is supported by our program partner, Lotus. So there will be 3 talks across this day. The first one is called Future Legacies that we'll be starting with. The second one's called Natural Cultures, and the third one's called Analog Memories. So if you haven't signed up for all of them yet, they're all sort of building on each other, but also quite independent. So feel free to kind of go back after this conversation on your phones and sign up for the next one, should you like. The signing is free. You just have to book a seat. So while that's happening, and I will not talk about that anymore before I pass it over to Anmol, but this forum is also the thought leadership platform for the wider London Design Festival, which is also what we kicked off yesterday, the 13th. It's on till 21st of September. There are loads of things happening around the city. There are different design districts that are part of it. There are a lot of independent, events and design producers, creators who are putting things out there for the public. So if you have a chance, please do go about and just see London in a very different sort of a vibe and energy throughout this week. With that, I would call upon Anmol Ahuja, who's also my colleague, but the chair for this first talk session for Lotus's day of program. Anmol.
Everyone, good morning. I suppose, and I hope I'm audible. Thank you firstly for coming out today for day 2 of the Global Design Forum. I bear immense gratitude towards each and every one of you for 2 main reasons, one of which sometimes already compounded upon. It's a Sunday, it's 11 a.m. It's a talk on futures and legacies, so I know what it takes to be here. But also because days and forums like this mark an important juncture in our times. As we emerge from a day of both celebration for us at STIR, because we did launch a festival yesterday, little minor shout out for that, and inhibition for the rest of London. It beckons us to discuss futures and legacies with caution, but also with hope and with rigor, with the tools that we bear. I profusely thank our program partner for the day, Lotus, with their commitment in putting all of this together, curatorial partners, STIR, and my senior Samta and Amit in the room. And we shall, with this panel, try to answer the question that I think bothers or keeps us maybe up at night all the time. Where do we come from and where do we go from here? And now please join me in welcoming our speakers for this day and this very important forum. We have Nigel Cottier with us, who is Design Director at Accept and Proceed. We have Kay Watson, who is Head of Arts and Technologies at Serpentine. And we have Gareth Rees, who is Lead Strategic Designer with Lotus. May I have you all on stage, please? Thank you. Well, quick mic check on this. All good? Thank you so much. So welcome, Nigel. Welcome, Gareth. Welcome, Kay. Again, my profuse thanks to you two for also making the commute. I know where you're all coming from. But more importantly, for joining us on this panel, where we will discuss future legacies. And as Samta did mention, the overall theme for this day is speculative certainties. So we do want to build upon how these 2 words sort of come together, where we are trying to see how something that seems to be inevitable meets with our daily jobs, meets with our daily works, meets with our daily profiles. So from that, as a starting point, I would like for us to perhaps delve on the idea of a footprint in trying and exploring what legacies might mean. Because when we did actually in the past think of a footprint, there was a very physical, tangible notion of that idea. But in the times that we live in, which are very hybrid in their existence, the idea of a footprint takes on different notions. We often, when we refer to footprints, it's almost synonymous with the digital footprint, which we are very conscious about. So what do you think that idea of footprint means in today's times, let's just say, where a digital footprint is more important than perhaps a physical one? Because when we do talk about a footprint, it marks a certain direction. It marks a certain, somebody leaving their steps in the sand, so to say. But when we do talk about digital footprints, they are alterable. They might be erased, they might be changed. So what does that idea of a legacy mean for each one of you, perhaps also reflecting on your bodies of work? I'd like to begin with you, Kay, in answering this.
That's a big question.
Start off.
I think it's worth sort of explaining what context I come from. I run an art and technology program in a public gallery, a public contemporary art gallery, that is. And I think it's worth saying that the institution that I am in, we're already talking about legacy, right? Because I'm in a legacy organization. And that kind of organization has, mine has over 50 years of reputation, of history, of all the things that it's, that forms part of what a sort of art institution is today. So there's that side of things, being within a legacy organization, a legacy institution, and what comes with that. And I think there's what you're talking about here, which is also about our relationship to the digital, which it's worth saying I would probably slightly reframe a little bit, because my department is arts technologies, is the department that we say was formerly called digital. And we changed our name to kind of move away from this idea of something that's completely intangible, and that the only work that we were doing existed online, and that in recognition of the stuff that we're doing comes with material, it's tangible, it's hybrid, as you say. So it's very much about how, our lives are this sort of hybrid mix. And the way our department is sort of formulated is around what role does art and culture have in the development of technologies? Not simply how do technologies influence how art and culture is seen or developed or any of these kinds of things. It's a two-way relationship that needs more institutional thought. So in my sort of context, the way I'm thinking about legacy is, what role do we have in how technologies develop? What role do we have in how they're used? What role do we have in how accessible they are? Rather than simply being a site of presentation of creativity that involves technology. So the legacy for me is around what our mission is as a public institution, what our mission is as a legacy institution, and what role art and culture has in, I guess, in societal development. And this is not something that can happen. It's not something that we're solely responsible. It's not something that all artists are solely responsible for. But I think that we have a role. I hope that answers the question.
It does, and it does also take me to Gareth, because this idea of a legacy body as a legacy institution or a legacy brand, Lotus is definitely one of them. It has been a pioneer in automobile development since the 60s. So where does that idea of legacy lead you in your current work, let's just say, and how would you say you continue to shape that in the present, perhaps, while also reflecting on it as something that perhaps belongs in the past?
Yeah, hi everyone. Legacy, I'd like to start in terms of the kind of definition of legacy. If you think about it, it's more about something from the past, something from predecessors, something from your ancestors. Whether that's a behavior, attitude, a way of thinking, a language, that then is, for me, that's culture. Legacy and culture for me then is the same thing. Legacy for Lotus, we have a very rich legacy in born from racing and innovation, and we have to respect that. But we also have to move forward with our brand and represent that legacy in a different way to make sure our brand is relevant in the future as well.
Thank you for that. Nigel, how would you say your work with Accept and Proceed continues to perhaps contribute to forming a legacy for the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think as a, Accept and Proceed as a kind of brand and design studio, and we work with big brands like Lego and Nike and IBM and stuff like that. And I think historically over the years, the legacy of Accept and Proceed as a studio and has an output and creating that work, which is hopefully really admired by people. I think we're sort of moving away from that in terms of through the sort of digital tools and the way that we do, and the work that I do is more about sort of, I guess, systems design and how we can kind of build with the brand teams that we work with and partner with, building systems that are kind of utilized by the in-house design team. So it's kind of setting those parameters and the kind of ways of expressing through the tools. But for that reason, you're sort of then 1 or 2 steps away from the outside world. You're not necessarily creating the work. So the idea of legacy for Accept and Proceed in terms of partnering with brands is we're not creating the work. It's the people within those teams that create it. So therefore, our legacy is really within those tools that we create and the conceptual thinking behind them, but also, I guess, the relationships that we build with the teams and the brand teams, and how we create kind of new ways of creating within that sort of collective experience. Also, the tools that we're creating are developed with sort of collaborative digital tools that we build in real time, and we're partnering with our internal teams, the brand teams that we work with, but also external developers and stuff like that. And there's no one entity creating this stuff. So therefore, the idea of it being a sort of personal legacy or an institution, kind of an organizational legacy, it's a little bit tricky. It's less tangible, right? Because we're not necessarily creating, in the traditional sense, you would design a brand and you design something and it would be recognized and rewarded, whereas now it's not really like that in terms of what we do, if that makes sense. I hope it kind of makes sense.
So for the next sort of question or talking point, I will actually come back to you, Nigel, and sort of go the other way around. I would like to explore this idea of, when we talk about, maybe you did expand upon what your firms or brands do in terms of establishing or building on legacies, shaping them actively in the present. How would you say, through some specific examples in your work, because I do know you work with digital typography, and typography or making type forms and designing them is an exercise in communication as old as time. So how would you say that aspect or that part of your work helps in shaping a digital legacy? Because there's through this sort of round of questions, I do want to try and arrive at the idea of a digital legacy, moving on from a digital footprint, on what sort of legacies might await us in the future that might take from the present in assuming a digital form. So how would you define this idea of a digital legacy through, let's say, the specific examples of your work and your experiments with typography?
Okay, yeah. So my sort of experimental typography work is kind of, I guess, it's more of a kind of an artistic endeavor in terms of it sits outside kind of the work that I do with Accept and Proceed. It's still systems thinking. It's kind of like taking, using alphabetical form and typography and figuring out ways of using it as a kind of container for conceptual and I guess expressive thinking, right? And I think obviously in the past sort of 5 to 10 years, basically since the inception of kind of variable type and also other digital tools for creating I guess that cross section between typography and other forms. You know, we have this great wave. I think social media has also contributed to that, where we have people really being quite experimental, sharing. It's almost become a bit of a dialogue, and that experimental typography has become a bit of a medium or an art form in itself. And I think that that sort of wave, it sort of sits outside sort of, I guess, mainstream design. You see it feeding into mainstream design, but it's a bit of its own sort of culture. And I think whether that sort of feeds into mainstream design is almost irrelevant. It's more about the fact that this dialogue and kind of interchange of ideas and stuff is happening. And I think that's really interesting. But in terms of a personal legacy around that, I'm not sure. I think maybe that's, I publish books as well, and I think maybe I do that in terms of, we live in this world where, because design is so iterative and the tools that we use are changing and they're cross-pollinating and all of that kind of stuff, it's quite hard to put it's hard to finish anything. And I think that's probably why I publish books, in a way to sort of consolidate some of these ideas and stuff like that. But I don't know if that particularly answered the question.
It's actually an interesting provocation, because when we do talk about the idea of a digital legacy, maybe the best preserver of that is as you answer a book. You know, your experiments are all done digitally. You obviously start from perhaps a point of sketching, perhaps drawing these. I did write about it, that they looked sort of like almost like primitive hieroglyphs, and in sort of like taking from the Romantic style, they do sort of appear anglicized in the end. So that sort of progression was very visible, and that exercise is carried out digitally. But the way that you document and record them is a very physical, tangible form. So that is a form of legacy keeping as old as time again, which is books. So coming to you, Gareth, your work at Lotus is of course about strategy, but also it intersects with the digital medium in very, very interesting ways. What would you say in terms of your work yielding a digital legacy, much like arriving at a medium, so to say? For example, for Nigel, it seems like the medium would be preserving through the kind of interactions that accept and proceed in the work may have picked up on social media as well as books. How would you say your work would yield a digital legacy in the future?
Yeah, it's quite a challenging job, because the Lotus Cars in the past has always been very an analog, extremely analog kind of company. Not only in engineering, but also in the experience that you have when you drive a Lotus. And I think digitally, as designers then, is for us to find a way how to represent that experience, not only kind of in a digital form, but in a combination with phygital kind of. I don't like I don't like the term, but it's obviously theirs. Yeah. But yeah, how we can capture that kind of visceral, more hands-on, more that analog, very emotional feeling in a digital way, and I think, yeah, it's that kind of getting that right. I think is the important thing for us as a brand as we move into the future. And I think there are ways that we can do that. And I think in terms of enhancing, using technology and digital technologies to enhance the focus on the driver rather than the distraction. Enhancing the environment around you as well in some way. Not cliche or pastiche, but in a totally new experience, but it's still maintaining our legacy as a brand.
That's again very interesting, because the outcome, so to say, is both tangible and intangible, because there is, at the end of the day, a car that a person or a driver takes home. But it's the overall experience of not just getting into the vehicle, navigating it with other technologies that sort of accompany automobiles these days, and to reduce distractions. And we will catch up on that because I'm very interested in like this idea of being or doing more, but also it seeming less, and how you establish that through technologies. But I'll move to Kay in perhaps the same line of questioning on what you think is the medium for your work and your body of work, especially in public programming, because that shift that you did mark between digital and now between arts and cultures is, I think, a particularly interesting one with your body of work at Serpentine. So what do you think is the medium with which, or via which, you might leave a sort of legacy, or a digital legacy, to be specific, in the future?
It's an interesting question. Let me try and work through this a little bit. I'm really interested in, Nigel, what you were saying about the kind of different scales, if you like, of impact or legacy. So, and I think this is something that we are working through from the kind of, you mentioned we were talking about personal, but individual versus institutional. But then there's also ecosystem, I think, and you know, the scales can continue to change in relation to, I think, the kind of, and I'm talking about this very institutionally, this is not how everyone should think about things, in terms of the different users or stakeholders in an organization such as mine. And I think that when we're talking about legacy, there's a few different things here we're talking about, from the archival, the kind of institution as a site of memory, if you like, versus anything from kind of artist development, talent development, through to public engagement, and everything that emerges through engagement with different kinds of publics. So I just wanted to talk about that in the context of what we do a little bit. And we kind of center this idea of creative experimentation, or we might call it R&D in some contexts, and organizational development and change in our work with art and technology. And that manifests in a number of different ways. We prioritize production, something that is actually pretty vastly undervalued in the art field. I think it's possibly much more well understood in design, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And through strategy, thought leadership. Thought leadership, such a horrible word, phrase. And kind of cross-sector collaboration. So because I think there is a tendency to be siloed within the art field, whereas actually we have really generative relationships with academia and industry and, you know, architecture, like whatever. So just as an example of a kind of project that we might do, I think it's worth talking about a project we did last year with artists and technologists called Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who some of you may have come across. They've been experimenting with AI for a very long time, particularly in the sort of development of sound and music. And we started working with them a couple of years ago. One of the kind of things we decided we would collaborate on is it possible to create a polyphonic choral AI model? And how would you go about designing that and governing that in an equitable way? So, you know, what that meant is working with them from the very beginning in terms of that they designed or wrote and composed a songbook which contained every phoneme of the English language. We then travelled across the UK recording professional and amateur choirs to develop a data set. That data set was then used to train a series of AI models, but we worked with every chorister involved to develop what we called the Choral AI Data Trust Experiment. That's the sort of The process of that has been released as a white paper. And around like what are the different kinds of data rights that are available to those who are engaging and giving their creative work to AI training. So that is a very quick way of me explaining what was a very long and complicated process, which is around thinking about, of course, like what is technology doing? What, you know, we can't not talk about AI really. But what are the governance strategies that are emerging from different sites of experimentation that can have much broader impact? And we also see, like, this project resulted in an exhibition, numerous different kinds of outputs that mean different kinds of impacts, and, you know, we're also talking about legacy as impact. So yeah, that's...
Continually shaping it in the present, yes.
Yes, yes. So that is a way of me explaining some of that stuff. Yes, yes. You know, and I think from a... You mentioned, like, what do we need to... How do we design for that future? And I think a big part from my perspective is what does the ecosystem look like, and how are we ensuring that from policy through to artists, you know, what should those things look like now and in the future? Because the way, like, the world is very different now, and a lot of the structures that are in place are not necessarily designed with today in mind. So that's my perspective on that.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, and you do have, I think, a very interesting video game commission coming up at the Serpentine next month as well. Yes.
In 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, yes. So that sounds very, very interesting. But I would really like to go back to this. You mentioned, of course, there's no way, and I will say this, that there's no way, unfortunately, that we cannot bring AI into this conversation. You know, there is the idea of what we can do. There always is that idea with digital technologies and their propagation, what we can do. But there's always a speed breaker, or there must be a speed breaker in terms of should we do it? That should is what really caught me off guard and sort of going off script, if I may, in questioning the ethics of producing these legacies in the everyday. So how would you say in your work, let's begin with you, Gareth, on this, how would you say that you are taking care of the ethical part of it in terms of shaping a more equitable future when we do talk about defining, molding, morphing continuously a legacy that we do want to leave behind in the present for the future?
Yeah, I've gone a bit off script there. And more.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's fine. But in terms of kind of, you talk about the equitability or the accessibility design, you see that in the kind of democratization of design with digital tools. And one thing I think it leads to what you were saying is a kind of, at what point does the kind of, let's say, legacy become dishonest or disingenuous in a digital domain as well? I won't slag any brands off or companies off, but it's the idea of, for me, it's quite relevant, is that if you use an electric vehicle, why should that have an internal combustion engine artificial sound? That's disingenuous to, perhaps, it's a carryover legacy feature, but it's disingenuous to the modern day or the future in some way, right? And I think there's also other ways that we can use. You talk about AI. You know, obviously everyone uses that in a creative sense. But you need to then respect the kind of honesty of your brand or your legacy. You need to somehow police that. And there's different ways that we can use. At Lotus, for instance, we use digital tools, and I say this not in terms of like traditional CAD, but let's say data interpretation, and AI is obviously part of that, to kind of define the actual product, not just the function, but the form and the use of it as well. And that's kind of the future of how we can do things. That also has obviously a great impact on kind of more the essentialism. I'm talking using digital to like a tangible way that has more impact in the way that we can design things for essentialism in terms of materials. Like obviously that has benefits of sustainability, and I think and also the great experience itself of the brand as well. So yeah, it's a tricky one. We're still learning, right? Within industry, everybody is how to deal with these tools, how to interact and connect with these tools. So, and you can see, if you're an observation, especially within our industry, automotive, you can see that brands are trying different things. You know, I don't know if you've ever driven a modern car. Now you have less buttons, for instance, and then that has an intrinsic kind of it creates some anxiety in some people because they don't have that physical, that haptic interaction with the experience that they have. So then they crave more analog experiences. So what we're seeing is this kind of ebb and flow, this kind of oscillation in the industry at the minute, back and forth.
Yes.
And it will eventually, we'll get it right, it'll balance out, everybody, and that's across multiple disciplines, you know. So, yeah. It's a tricky one. We talk about certainties in these talks, but I think it's a lot about uncertainties, and you cannot speculate certainty. There's a juxtaposition there within the title. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you for that larger reflection on the theme for the day, because it is entirely incumbent to also, for me, to introduce this thought into the room that there's no 100% in defining what the ethics can be, because even though we do talk about technologies as something that's fixed, we do very much talk about it in the moment, because we literally do not know what kind of technologies may come up in the future, what kind of technologies may already be outdated as we do continue this forum. That's the pace of things that we are dealing with. So ethics at the same time cannot be something that's entirely fixed. And I do bear gratitude towards you for bringing this into the conversation. So what will you say, Nigel, in terms of, at this moment, because we do want to move with a sort of temporal definition of ethics along with the temporal definition of technologies that we are working with currently. How would you say ethics seep into your work, or how would you say you consciously define or you consciously continue to sort of alter that definition in your mind when you do work with digital tools particularly?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think, you know, we are at a bit of a crossroads in terms of, you know, we talked about kind of the collaborative element of the tools that we use to create, and by their sort of nature, they are inherently really, really good at allowing collectively to create something. And I think there's an ownership. There's a kind of a delicacy around kind of ownership and who owns what in that sort of dialogue and stuff, and especially when you throw AI into the mix, it's like it becomes a bit of a soupy mess, right? And I think what we try and do in terms of Accept and Proceed's work is the sort of fundamentals behind why we do stuff is hopefully with good intent. And I think as long as you have that at the sort of beginning and making sure that the organizations you work with are held to account in a way, then that helps in that sort of ethical thing. But the kind of use of these digital tools and stuff like that, it's an ever-changing landscape, and I think it's a difficult one to answer. But yeah, I hope that sort of.
It's also a lot of in-process stuff that we do hope not just us, but also people in the room can take back with them in terms of thinking about ethics in daily practices, because we are completely aware of the fact that our work, or even just writing emails, that has been going on for decades now and is the prima facie means of communication. It's not the most environment-friendly way, let's just say, you know. So we are very aware of like how we work, how much our lives are intertwined with the digital medium, and how much that sort of bears that sort of caution and consciousness upon us when we do talk about legacies, because that is something that weighs upon us constantly, and that is also upon us to leave for the future, you know. Yeah. But that brings me to this idea, and ethics was super important in terms of shaping the entire argument, in terms of how ubiquitously technology surrounds us. We might just say that apart from discussing the idea of digital legacies, we do want to shape and define digital cultures, because we do work in the cultural sector, all of us, at least in this side of the room. And we do try to shape it more consciously. Therefore, I think, again, the discussion about ethics was much welcome. But we do want to try and shape that sort of, the idea of the technology being all surrounding, let's just say, and how that contributes to the idea of a digital culture. So in the final section of our talk, maybe we can talk about how we must, or how we do consciously in our daily practices, try to shape this definition of a digital culture, and how we wish or we hope people can interact with those little semantics in our design processes, in our design languages and outputs, how people interact with them in establishing more meaningful design culture, because that, I think, is one of the best ways to leave behind a legacy, so to say. So how would you say in our daily practices, I'm going to begin with you, Kay, how would you say in your curation and public programming for the Serpentine, would you say that we are trying to facilitate a more informed digital culture?
I mean, it's all based on that. It's worth me saying that in my context, digital culture also has a kind of its own sort of life, which is like digital. I think it's maybe a bit archaic now, but digital as a space has its own culture, and in some academic writing, we're in post-digital culture now. So I'm not an academic. I'm way more pragmatic in my way of operation. But there's that kind of like, I think we're talking about like digital culture as like process, if I'm right, as well as a space of culture in its own right, like with its own kind of creative rules that exists in some of these like spaces. So just to say, I think about it in those two different ways. But in terms of my work, I would think of it more as like our work as a program. I mean, that's the reason it exists is about really interrogating and understanding the minutiae of what technologies are doing in our everyday lives. So, and we do that through, creative experiments with certain technologies, whether that's video games, biotech, AI, blockchain, but also on the other side of our kind of R&D innovation strategy work. So I'm interested in everything, both like the workings of and really understanding working with these tools as material and anything like that, but also what's the legal framework that we need when we're talking about ownership of materials? What's the policy framework required for the present moment? What's the what are the what are all the frameworks that are needed? So personally, I see it as like, yes, working with the materials, understanding them, the sort of day-to-day operation and all that kind of stuff. But then it's like, what's the infrastructure and how do we need to evolve certain infrastructures for the kind of ethical or perspective or to have the kinds of technologies and platforms that we want shaping our society. So yeah, that would be my approach. That is my approach.
I think it's very interesting because when we do talk about concepts that are not very individualistic like a legacy, it is individualistic, but it often has bearings on many, many people, and especially on how it is perceived beyond you, after you. So it is important to sort of stay on track with the idea that there's lots of other ground realities, like the realities of what you just talked about. In terms of that on-ground framework, I think it's very important that we do bear in mind that legacies, while we do perceive them in a individualistic capacity, and we do try to shape them with that, it's often also institutional. It often also is incumbent and relies upon communities. And that sort of breaks away from the idea of, well, my legacy or an individualistic legacy.
Can I just also add to that, something that I haven't said, is like, it also is always changing.
Yes.
So And I think sometimes I see this in the art sector, is like, oh, we've come up with this way of dealing with AI now. And it's like, that's today. Tomorrow you'll need something very different.
Yes.
And it's like this, it's also like constant, which feels like a lot, like, but it's also this like constant engagement and constant interaction and constantly returning to those things. So it's never just like we've dealt with that today.
Have we dealt with AI is,
No.
yeah, it's not a question for this panel, but I think it's something that sort of continue ringing in our heads. But for you, Gareth, I think this question bears much more consonance in terms of interfaces. When we do talk about digital cultures that so ubiquitously surround us, in terms of automobiles and in terms of your own design processes, the digital is almost inseparable from what you like start with, perhaps on a sketchbook. But you do want to design, as you did say, meaningful interfaces for people to interact with the technologies that you are building. How would you say you do that so that you can ensure that this digital culture, people are more consciously engaging with that?
I think I'll build off what Kay said in terms of the ethics of, let's say, especially digital footprint, and Lotus as a legacy brand, a tangible legacy is how we move forward in the future. And I really think that tech brands or tech-led brands, I often think about this from a user experience point of view. It's like they're essentially harvesting our digital footprint, right, to make money. That's the end of it. And there should be a better way that we can use digital footprints to design better interfaces, better systems, better outcomes in the future. And they're at an advantage because they know your purchasing behaviors, they know your personal details, they even know your biometric data as well. So they have the power then to design digital or physical services or outcomes that are actually more on point to your digital footprint. And I think it's really, I think about that a lot within a legacy brand, and I think we have opportunities to perhaps design things in a better way, whether that's right or wrong. Obviously, there's ethics within that. We have the opportunity to design things that are more interconnected with the user, perhaps even more personable, more even in tune with that person's attitude, their mindset as well. So it's a big topic, and I think so we have to find a way in that as well. Yeah.
Much like there are iterations in the design process, I felt like when we were approaching this talk, because both the terms that sort of are in the mnemonics of our future and legacies, both of them are superiorly heavy terms. We do want to sort of like arrive at answers, and that's not ever the point, but it's also about the same way that there are iterations in the design process. This talk itself is an iteration in the overall conversation that must carry on, because future and legacies are both interconnected, but also extremely important for each one of us to figure out. But Nigel, just to close this off before we can head to audience interactions, there are specific examples that have interested me about your work. For example, the basketball code that you did design, but that was for Nike. The basketball code that Accept and Proceed worked on. The basketball code. That was with Nike, I think.
It was, yeah.
Yes. So that idea about, so you're working with a brand, but you're actually like sort of working through your hybrid means of and methods on a very physical space, a space that will be left open for the public. It does not belong to the particular brand, but it is an exercise with a brand. Mm-hmm. However, that when you are in that space, you do see that it functions, works, feels very different to a conventional basketball feel, in that sense. That court just performs differently for the people in there. That, for me, is a very physical manifestation of a different kind of design culture. So I do want to sort of shift the conversation a little bit in the closing towards your process behind that, and perhaps seeing how the digital might supersede or cross that boundary into the physical realm, in perhaps defining a more sentient understanding of a digital culture that surrounds you in terms of spaces, as Kay mentioned.
That's a difficult question.
It's an interesting example that basketball court, you know, was, I think, you know, we obviously kind of approach that. It's a physical space, and you have to kind of understand the physical structures of a basketball court, and it's very important because people need to be able to know where the three-point line is and stuff. But being able to play with that structure in a way that's quite sort of fun and experimental, I think is we always sort of treat that sort of method of respecting what's around, what you need to keep, and then sort of flexing in terms of how much expression you can bring to that environment is something that we always try and do. But in terms of it, I'm not quite sure if I understand how that sort of gets us back to the kind of digital legacy. Sorry, I'm just
we will find a way for sure.
But yeah, I think it's about an approach and a kind of methodology, and making sure that is correct throughout whatever you do in terms of yeah.
Because in terms of physical space, that stays. This provocation comes from when Kay said that there's a spatial framework to defining that sort of legacy. This space is going to stay. It's for the community gets to use it on the daily.
Yeah.
But it still feels and performs, as I said, differently from conventional basketball courts that are, a social infrastructure, that are government interventions. So from that perspective is what I wanted to approach this question as, in terms of how your process might have differed when you solely work in the digital medium, you know.